All right, well, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and fantastic to be on this excellent panel. I think it actually really complements some of the work that we were doing. I'm very pleased to present some of the work alongside my colleague at Hampton University, Dr. Daren Fisher. And this is part of a broader project where we had the fortune, misfortune, call it what you will, of having already set up an automated data collector on a site that proved to be pretty important in the lead up to the January 6th attack in the US. I'm sure we're all fairly familiar with what happened, but briefly, it was a significant threat to the peaceful transfer of presidential power in the US. It was prominent in quite a while for the lead up to January 6th, as many, I'm sure, in the room were kind of pressing that alarm button the entire time. But we did see that online communication played an absolutely fundamental role as a part of this, both in terms of mobilization as well as fostering motivations for violence, and indeed even in the planning of the insurrection itself. So for this project, we were specifically interested in focusing on ways that members of the communities engaged with other members of the communities, how they responded to offline events, and how they reacted to signals from elites. So we know that online doesn't exist in a vacuum, of course. There is the kind of touch grass real world, and things happen and they interact with one another. So we were interested in seeing how that worked. In particular, we did this through the lens of looking at online forums again. And I know we're in the room where everybody is familiar, but while we recognize that there are important differences between online rhetoric and real world violence, it bears noting that online forums are a really interesting and important window to understanding how people in extremist movements go on to engage in political violence. And this is through kind of the spread of motivations and techniques. Again, we know that there are really interesting ways to test key theoretical hypotheses through the use of online forums. And the really cool part that I kind of keep falling back on is that you are seeing the data as the people who are also engaging on these platforms are seeing the data. You're seeing it in the context of these threads. You're seeing it in the way that they talk to each other. And so it's a really, really interesting and useful platform to do so. And in particular, when we're looking at political violence or the movement toward political violence, it actually can provide really unique insights into what are otherwise hidden conversations. So while we know that there are very few people who have excellent access to secured communication platforms, there are web forums that are unsecured communication platforms, and users on those platforms, while being aware of the fact that it's unsecured, do take some adaptations. And so that was something that came through and we were interested in. And in particular, again, we know that this was a platform that was of key interest both to the January 6th committee in the wake of the event, as well as it was a place where anonymous users were able to interact with each other, voice their grievances, and as kind of that hornet's nest metaphor, they kind of move together and they rile each other up, and it keeps on growing a little bit momentum. So these are some of the factors that we did see on the way in. So this was, unfortunately or fortunately, again, an embarrassment of riches. We know that in the context of political violence, most people who are exposed to violent beliefs don't go on to commit types of acts of terror or hate crime. We also know that most people who hold those beliefs don't necessarily go on to do either of those things. And even if the beliefs are necessarily dispelled, we don't know if that necessarily has an appreciable impact on subsequent behavior. There's been some really interesting work, in particular a meta-analysis that came out 1-2 years ago, that shows that it is a meaningful risk factor, but we don't know necessarily if there's a symmetry between risk factors and kind of reduction of risk factors, protective factors. So this platform, and in particular these data, provide unique insights into how some members of these communities led to terrorism. And the really fun part about this project, again, is we collected these data prospectively. Stepping very briefly into the realm of theory, this is, again, is a part of a broader project where we're looking at the role of deterrence. This is one of the OGs, Cesare Beccaria, where he talks about the certainty, celerity, and severity of punishment. And in particular, there was a kind of less studied hypothesis as a part of his original work that looked at the promises of sanctuary and pardons and promised resources to individuals who would still go on to engage in criminal behavior, but in the presence of these kind of carrots or kind of protective factors from the state, it actually encourages violence. So we looked at specific linguistic strategies employed by users on thedonald.win that, again, we know is pretty important in the lead up to January 6th. I'm very happy to talk until the cows come home about the data, but to just briefly go over it, it's 928,000 plus prospectively collected posts on thedonald.win. It was an automated web scraper that I set up to twice a day grab the front page of posts as well as the first JSON worth of comments on each post, and it was compiled daily with deduping from September 28th through after January 6th, so a super interesting period of study. This is where I would normally defer to my excellent colleague, who's a much more competent qualitative scholar, but I'm happy to try and answer questions as they emerge. But functionally, Daren read through all of the posts, which I would never recommend to anyone, looking at kind of the frequency and use of phrases, seeing kind of what's said, how was it said, and we've got some interesting graphs to illustrate that, as well as what did it mean in the context and how did these kind of emergent themes come up as a consequence. And while in Vivo 14 is the most current version, we're on a budget, so we were doing our best with 12. So replication is important, but we also understand that there are pressures. So very briefly, as the title suggested, there were three major themes that came out of this, specifically the incidence of grievance, influence of the platform in particular, and then mobilization of the users in conjunction with each other and in response to different external stimuli toward violence. Jumping right into it, and again, I'm going to take a page out of Joe's book and not force you guys to hear me read all of these individual quotes. I've tried to bold some of the kind of key aspects of it, but these are illustrating that while there are a lot of ideas of grievance that other researchers have described and were present in these data sets, we specifically thought it was interesting that there was the presence of victims, but they didn't claim their victimhood. They used kind of the idea of other people being victims as a motivation for themselves. So in particular, the second quote here is a homage to the Tree of Life synagogue shooting, where they are saying, oh, well, they do all these things to each other, they do all these things to us, and we only get kind of a nominal reference in the back of the paper. So clearly we're the victims here, but like, that's not really the focus here. We're going to actually go out and do something about it, right? And then there are a handful of other quotations here where, again, they're focusing on the fact that we, as the majority, primarily male white users on this platform, are the least victimized people. But we're still mad about it. And because society is turning on us as this least victimized group, we're going to still do something about it. There are also 100 other authors who speak very eloquently about grievance, so I know this is a room full of many of them. One of the other interesting factors was specifically looking at the influence of the platform itself with respect to perceived insulation that these users tried to render onto themselves as a function of also still giving themselves permission to escalate over the period. One of the phrases that I'm sure we've all had bandied about is kind of the term in Minecraft. It was used as a protective behavior because they said that it gave them plausible deniability for anything that they were actually planning to do offline. But if you're only doing it in the context of a video game, well, clearly it's not an actual threat. Now, I want you guys to note the dates on this. This is September and October. This is from this period, before the election, before the call for violence, and certainly before the insurrection itself. So over this period, we see, oh yeah, that's when Joe Biden was declared the winner, and he said, we're going to get straight to work, spiking in Minecraft, because, well, now they're more motivated, more interested in doing things, and still giving themselves plausible deniability. And likewise, we've all had kind of the will be wild tweet shoved down our throats 100 times. I'll be publishing again on it, hopefully. But we see the largest spike in kind of this, we're insulating ourselves from legal risk, but also it's very clearly an indication that these people are contemplating and interested in offline action. And then another really interesting aspect of this unsecured but anonymous posting platform was the awareness and paranoia of potential external actors and infiltrators. And again, I think that this also pulls back to the idea of plausible deniability. They were able to say, well, that person who's advocating for violence and saying that they should do things offline, they're just a glowy. If you're not familiar with the term, it's a reference to people that are radioactive because they're actually just like an FBI plant or a CIA operative who might be posting on these platforms and saying something to rile up the rest of the members on the platform, the users. And so what we see here is that even though they were aware that they were being monitored and this was an open platform, they were still posting incredibly violent, incredibly toxic material. And again, these are prior to the incident itself. Again, just quickly illustrating frequency of the term, we see some spikes around, again, the will be wild tweet. That's that big spike in the middle there. And then, of course, after January 6th, they said, no, 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 we weren't doing this. That was the glowies. Only the glowies were talking about doing violent stuff. Not really. Finally, we've got some interesting evidence of kind of mobilization through conflating what they were interested in doing with existing sources of fantasy to translate kind of their existing grievances into a hopeful future where they could take righteous action. So you could run down basically the top list of the last 20 movies that you were really interested in or thought might have a cool message or might have some kind of action violence, and they probably made a reference to it. These are the ones that we picked out. But this mobilization went from just general calls to engagement, and again, keep an eye on the date there, that is pre-Will Be Wild, to specific mobilization toward action. And one of the ones that just really jumps out for me because it was a headline of a post was, "Does Daddy want us armed or not?" referring to Trump. And the headline for that particular tweet, or that post that was stickied at the top of the forum for this entire period was, Trump tweet, "Daddy says be in DC January 6th, will be wild." And that was top of the forum, top thing that anyone on the platform was seeing for every day starting December 19th, oddly enough, until January 7th when it was taken down. So these are specific actions and specific risks that these individuals are indicating as they were approaching the event, and specifically after an external call to violence and mobilization by an elite. Now, we are far be it from without limitations in this. We recognize that not all people on these forums were legitimate actors. There is some evidence that members who are individuals who are posting may have been either bots or they could have been kind of agents provocateur from other outside governments. But fundamentally, that's not actually essential. And this is kind of my favorite twist on this, is that the presence of those posts and the popularity of those posts in that language actually normalizes and reinforces existing justifications for violence. And while those individuals may not necessarily have been involved in specific planning behaviors, it kind of lowered the threshold that other members on those forums may have been approaching as we move toward the incident of violence. And again, while we saw that there was quite a bit of anonymization among users, obviously people don't use their first and last name on these, that would actually lead us to believe that while some of this posting may be just kind of flaming or inflammatory rhetoric, if they're anonymous, why not just post the way you actually feel about it? So there's some caveats to that, of course. And finally, the data set made it incredibly difficult to dual code things. Again, I will defer to my incredible colleague, Dr. Daren Fisher, for his true labor of love, or whatever, coding all of these. We did not dual code these, but we are planning on going back through before we send it out, because it's 900,000 posts of pretty gnarly stuff. And then again, there is a really important note about the generalizability of these findings and the patterns that we saw. While leading up to January 6th, the Donald.win was relatively obscure. You kind of had to know where you were going to find it. In the period since then, people are a little more aware, and people kind of have their eyes out for more of these different types of obscure forums. And as a consequence, some of the different patterns of behavior and some of the cognizance of their being observed might actually shift behavior. So moving forward, got to keep an eye on what's happening. Now, we know that this was a pattern as we observed in 2016. And of course, in the present case, we were talking about 2020. And of course, there's also evidence that there's threats about this moving forward. So we think that this is a really important project, and we are continuing to do some data collection on a variety of different platforms leading into the future. So keep your ear to the ground, I suppose. Thank you very much. Very happy to answer any questions.